2 in the morning, June 6, 1944. Major Heinz von Luck presses a radio receiver to his ear. Static. Nothing but static. Outside his command post, something is falling from the sky. Dozens of shapes, then dozens more, drifting down under pale parachutes, lit by the flash of anti-aircraft fire. His men are already moving, rifles up, trucks starting, an entire regiment about to be thrown into the dark, toward an enemy that isn't there. Because the shapes falling over Normandy tonight are not soldiers. They are dolls, 3 feet of burlap and sand rigged with firecrackers, built to sound like gunfire the second they hit the ground. There are no actors in this story, no invented characters. Every name, every rank, every hour you're about to hear comes from military records and the testimony of the men who lived through this exact night. And in the next 14 hours, one carefully engineered lie is going to help decide the outcome of the Second World War. Right now, nobody wearing a German uniform knows that. All they know is that the sky is full of enemies, the phones have gone dead, and somewhere out there, the real invasion has already begun. They just don't know where. To understand how a man like Heinz von Luck ends up chasing ghosts through a French field at 2 in the morning, you have to understand what the Germans thought they had built. By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany had spent nearly 2 years constructing something they called the Atlantic Wall. 2,000 miles of coastline from the tip of Norway to the border of Spain. Bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, steel obstacles driven into the sand at low tide, sharp enough to gut a landing craft. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, poured by forced labor, under the direction of organization Tot. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had personally walked that coastline, section by section, in the months before the invasion. He was never satisfied. More mines, more obstacles, more depth. He believed one thing above all else. The invasion had to die on the beaches, in the first hours, not the first week. The first hours, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive, he told his staff that spring. Once the Allies got a real foothold inland, he said. The war in the West was already over, so the wall was built to see everything coming. Radar swept the channel around the clock. Coastal batteries had their firing solutions calculated in advance for every stretch of sand. Intelligence reports climbed a rigid chain of command, all the way to Berlin, all the way to Hitler. On paper, nothing could cross that water without Germany knowing, hours ahead of time, exactly where it would land. That was the theory. That was what Berlin had been told to believe. Heinz von Luck commanded the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, part of the 21st Panzer Division, dug in near Caen, 32 years old. A career officer, and a good one. Poland, France, North Africa, all fought alongside Rommel himself. He wasn't a fanatic. He was a professional, and he understood something most men in his position didn't. If the panzers moved fast enough, in the first hours, before the Allies could dig in, they could drive the entire invasion back into the sea. Everyone on both sides of the channel knew. Allied planners had studied it for 2 years, which is exactly why the first Battle of D-Day was never going to be fought with tanks, or artillery, or soldiers at all. It was going to be fought with information, or more precisely, with the absence of it. Von Luck's evening of June 5th had been almost boring. Routine patrols, dinner with his officers, reports of rough channel weather that German meteorologists insisted ruled out any invasion for days. Rommel himself had judged the seas too rough to justify staying. He was already on the road home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. An ordinary night, which is exactly what made what came next so disorienting. For nearly 2 years, a second, quieter war had been running underneath the one everyone fought with double agents feeding false reports to Berlin, with fake radio traffic simulating armies that didn't exist, with inflatable tanks parked in open fields, waiting to be photographed by German reconnaissance planes. The Germans believed an entire phantom army was massing in southeast England, ready to strike Calais. They even had a name for it, the 1st United States Army Group. It had a real commander on paper, General George Patton, and almost nothing else. No soldiers, no tanks, just radio operators, working around the clock to convince German intelligence that 80,000 men were waiting across the narrowest stretch of the Channel. That deception had a code name, Operation Fortitude. It would keep entire German armies frozen near Calais for weeks after the real invasion had already landed, waiting for a second blow that was never coming. But tonight, a smaller and far more immediate piece of that same deception was about to unfold directly in front of Heinz von Luck. It was called Operation Titanic. Its only job was to make the sky itself lie. The planning had started months earlier, inside a converted country house in England, where intelligence officers and stage designers, some of them pulled straight from the film industry, worked out exactly how convincing a fake soldier had to be. At 200 feet in total darkness, seen through the eyes of a frightened 19-year-old sentry, they tested different weights of burlap, different amounts of sand ballast, so the dummies would fall and hit the ground with something close to the speed of a real man. They timed the firecracker charges to go off a few seconds after landing, the way a real soldier might take a moment to get his bearings before opening fire. Every detail mattered, because the plan depended on one simple, slightly uncomfortable truth about frightened men in the dark. Nobody inspects a falling shape for authenticity. They react. They report. They call for reinforcements. And by the time anyone gets close enough to see what they're actually looking at, the damage is already done. Just after midnight, Royal Air Force bombers crossed the Channel in small formations, engines low, flying toward Le Havre, toward the Cotentin Peninsula, open farmland, miles from where the real American and British airborne divisions were about to jump for real. Inside the bomb bays, crates packed with 3-foot dummies. The British called them Ruperts, each one rigged to detonate on impact, mimicking small arms fire. Some carried gramophone recordings of gunfire and shouted orders, played through hidden speakers dropped alongside them. A handful of real Special Air Service soldiers jumped down with the dolls, just enough to fire a few real rounds, cut a real telephone wire, and vanish before any German patrol arrived to check. To a soldier running through a black field at 2 in the morning, the evidence was overwhelming. Parachutes tangled in the branches, muzzle flashes in the distance, shouting, English, unmistakably English, somewhere just ahead. An entire airborne invasion, materializing out of nothing. It worked exactly as designed. Units up and down the coast tore away from their real defensive positions to hunt phantoms. Regional headquarters was buried under reports of landings, 6, 8, 10 locations, sometimes within the same half hour. Officers trained for 2 years to react fast and decisively to real intelligence suddenly had no way to tell a genuine airborne assault from a burlap doll and a firecracker. Von Luck's own regiment was one of the units sent out to investigate. Trucks rumbled into the dark toward a landing zone that, by first light, would hold nothing but craters, spent flares, and the torn silk of empty parachutes hanging in the trees like something out of a nightmare no one could explain. But the dolls falling from the sky were only half the trap. The other half had been building quietly inside France itself for months, and it was about to close. The French resistance had been waiting for this exact night for years. Since early 1944, BBC Radio Londres had broadcast coded messages into occupied France, fragments of poetry, phrases that meant nothing on their own, sent out night after night, month after month, so the Germans could never be sure which broadcasts mattered and which were noise. On the night of June 5th, one specific set of those phrases finally went out over the air. For resistance cells across Normandy, it meant one thing: tonight, now, begin. In villages across the region, men and women who had spent years pretending to be nothing more than farmers, railway workers, telephone operators, quietly became soldiers for the first time. Some had been waiting for this exact signal since the day they joined their cell, never knowing if it would ever actually come. Some cut wires with tools hidden inside hollowed-out fence posts. Others, working inside telephone exchanges under German supervision by day, sabotaged switchboards from within, disconnecting lines in ways that looked, at first glance, like ordinary equipment failure. It bought precious extra time before anyone realized what was actually happening. Within hours, Telephone lines connecting German coastal units to their headquarters were cut in hundreds of separate places. Railways were sabotaged. Radio relay stations were destroyed outright. Now picture a German communications officer, somewhere on that coast, holding a phone that gives him nothing but a deadline. Somewhere out there, other units are reporting chaos. He has no way to confirm any of it. No way to know if the paratroopers near his sector are real men or scarecrows stuffed with sand. He has to decide, blind, whether to send his soldiers into the dark to fight an enemy that might not exist. And a few miles away, real paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne are landing for real, fighting for real, dying for in the fields behind Utah Beach. Fake landings that looked completely convincing. Real landings nobody could, and no working phone line left anywhere to sort out which was which. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first towns to fall that night, the confusion cut both ways. American paratroopers came down directly over the town square, some landing on rooftops. One caught for hours on the church steeple while the battle raged beneath him. The German garrison had no way of knowing, in those first chaotic minutes, whether this was the entire threat or just the leading edge of something enormous. They fought house to house against an enemy whose true size they could only guess at. Consider Major General Wilhelm Falle, commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, stationed directly beneath one of the real drop zones near that same town. Falle had spent the evening at a wargaming exercise in Rennes, running through this exact scenario, an airborne assault behind the coast. When word reached him after midnight that something was happening near his own headquarters, he got in his staff car immediately. He didn't wait for confirmation. He didn't wait for daylight. He never made it back. His car ran straight into a patrol of American paratroopers on the road to his own command post. He was killed within the first hours of the invasion, one of the only German commanders to correctly guess, almost instantly, that the threat near him was real. And he was cut down before that instinct could matter to anyone but him. Meanwhile, commanders elsewhere on the coast were still chasing reports of parachutes in fields where sunrise would reveal nothing but burlap, sand, and scorched grass. Some of those reports came from veteran officers, men who had fought in Poland, in France, in Russia, men who had seen real combat and knew, in theory, exactly what a genuine airborne assault looked like. That was the cruelty of it. This wasn't a trick that only fooled green recruits. It fooled hardened professionals because it was never designed to be examined closely. It was designed to be glimpsed for 3 seconds in the dark, just long enough to trigger a phone call, a diverted convoy, a wasted hour that could never be recovered. There was a saboteur behind almost every German advantage that night. Coastal radar, meant to give hours of warning before any fleet came into view, had already been battered by targeted Allied bombing in the days before the invasion. And on the night itself, Allied aircraft dropped thousands of strips of metallic chaff, a tactic the British called window, painting false fleets across German radar screens, while the real convoy crept toward Normandy in relative silence, buried under all that manufactured noise. A German radar operator that night saw an enormous naval force approaching Calais, exactly where the Deception wanted him looking. The real fleet barely registered. Radar, radio, telephone, human eyes on the ground. Every single sense the German command relied on had been fed false information, jammed, or physically severed within the same handful of hours, not by accident, by design. Because the planners behind this operation understood something the men defending the Atlantic Wall never had time to learn that night. The wall's true weakness was never its concrete. It was the assumption that the men behind it could trust what they saw and heard. There's a specific kind of fear that comes from facing an enemy you cannot verify. A sentry who spots real soldiers can judge their number, their direction, their intent. A sentry who spots a doll he mistakes for a man and then finds nothing where that man should, is left with something far worse. The conviction that the enemy is not just present, but somehow invisible. That fear spread through the German ranks almost as fast as the dolls themselves fell from the sky. Some German soldiers who survived the war later admitted, in interviews decades afterward, that the not knowing was worse than the actual fighting. A visible enemy could be aimed at, fought, understood, An enemy made of rumor and static could not. It seeped into every decision that morning, slowing reactions that should have been instant, planting hesitation in men who had been trained, for years, never to hesitate. By 4 in the morning, the reports pouring into German regional headquarters at Caen had become almost impossible to read. Landings near Normandy, landings near the mouth of the Seine, landings dozens of miles inland, in places no invasion fleet could possibly reach. Somewhere buried inside that flood of noise sat the truth. The real drop zones behind Utah and Omaha, and an armada of nearly 7,000 ships now closing on the actual invasion front. But no single officer on that coast had the authority, or, after 2 years of rigid doctrine, the nerve, to separate fact from fiction and act alone. Inside the headquarters of Army Group B, Rommel's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, was fielding the chaos in his commander's absence, trying to build a coherent picture from fragments that refused to add up. One report said airborne troops had landed near Caen. Minutes later, another claimed those same troops had already been eliminated, a claim that would later prove to be based almost entirely on burlap dummies mistaken for dead soldiers. A third report described naval gunfire off beaches that, according to the map in front of him, shouldn't have faced any serious threat at all. Speidel later admitted headquarters genuinely could not tell, that morning, whether they were watching a full-scale invasion or an elaborate raid designed to pull reserves away from the real target, still to come at Calais. That doubt had been engineered months in advance, and it was doing exactly what it was built to do. Every extra hour of confusion was another hour the invasion force got to dig in a little deeper, unload a little more equipment, push a little farther inland. And here is where the deepest flaw in the entire German command structure turned against the men trying to defend it. The single most powerful weapon on the Normandy coast that night wasn't a gun. It was 4 Panzer Divisions held in strategic reserve, including the battle-hardened 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division. Under Hitler's own command structure, those divisions could not move without his direct personal authorization, and Hitler was asleep. His staff at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in southern Germany, knew he had taken sleeping medication the night before. No one was willing to wake him over reports that might, for all anyone could confirm in the chaos, still turn out to be nothing. Chief of the Armed Forces High Command Staff, Alfred Jodl, reviewed the incoming reports himself and made the call not to disturb him. So the reserves waited. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging commander-in-chief in the West, tried repeatedly to get authorization to release the tanks on his own initiative. He was refused. The order had to come from the top, and the top was asleep in Bavaria, a world away from a coast where his army was losing the most important battle of the entire war, one silent hour at a time. Some historians have asked whether even a fully awake Hitler would have released the reserves any faster, given how convinced German command remained, for weeks afterward, that Normandy might still be a feint before the real invasion at Calais. But that question misses the point of what made this deception so effective. It was never designed to fool one man, once. It was designed to make every single layer of the German command, from a lieutenant staring at a dead phone line all the way up to the Führer himself, doubt what was happening at the exact same moment, so that no one, at any level, felt confident enough to act alone. That is something no amount of concrete could ever have defended. Heinz von Luck, still out hunting dummies with his own regiment, later described the paralysis in blunt terms. Everyone up and down that coast could see that something enormous was happening. Almost nobody had the authority to act on. By the time Hitler finally woke, reviewed the reports, and authorized the Panzer reserves to move, it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. 14 hours after the first false parachutes had drifted down over French farmland. 14 hours after real Allied troops had begun coming ashore, under real fire, on 5 real beaches. 14 hours the German High Command would never get back. Some units didn't wait for Berlin. Local commanders watching real landing craft approach through their binoculars, threw whatever artillery and infantry they had into position, fighting with only the resources already under their own authority. It slowed the invasion in places. It cost lives on both sides, and it proved that individual courage was never in short supply among the men defending that coast. What was in short supply was a command structure fast enough and trusting enough of its own information to bring the full weight of Germany's reserves to bear, while there was still time to change the outcome. By the time that structure finally moved, the battle it existed to win had already slipped away from it. There's a particular irony buried in the German military had built its reputation for years on speed, on the doctrine of striking fast and decisively before an enemy could react. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was the philosophy that had conquered Poland and France in a matter of days. And on the one morning, it needed that speed more than any other. Its own command structure, designed for total central control, became the single largest obstacle standing between the reserves and the coast. The wall's greatest weakness wasn't in the sand. It was in the chain of command standing behind it. As dawn broke fully over Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, the men defending the Atlantic Wall were still fighting an enemy they couldn't fully see. In a battle, the coastal batteries opened fire on the landing craft directly in front of them because that much was real. But the one counterattack that could have thrown the entire invasion back into the sea, the fast, concentrated strike of armor Rommel had warned for months would only work in the very first hours, didn't come in time. By the time the Panzer reserves finally rolled toward the coast that afternoon, Allied troops had already secured beachheads on all 5 landing zones. Engineers were clearing obstacles from the sand. Wave after wave of men, tanks, and supplies were already coming ashore behind the first assault. By late afternoon, elements of the 21st Panzer Division, Heinz von Luck's own division, finally pushed toward the coast near Sword Beach. The only German armored counterattack of the entire day to come anywhere close to reaching the water. For a brief window, it looked as though a thin wedge of German tanks might actually drive a gap between the British beachheads. It wasn't enough, and it came too late. British anti-tank guns, naval gunfire from offshore warships, and the sheer weight of men and equipment already ashore ground the attack down before it could turn into anything decisive. By nightfall, the division pulled back, its one real chance to reach the beach on the first day already gone. 14 hours earlier, that same division had spent its critical opening hours hunting dolls in the dark, instead of forming up for exactly this kind of strike, back when the invasion was still weak enough to break. By nightfall, on June 6th, roughly 156,000 Allied troops had come ashore or landed by air across the Normandy front. The fighting through the hedgerows that followed would grind on for weeks, brutal, costly, and far from decided by deception alone. But the one outcome Rommel had staked everything on preventing had already happened. The Allies had a permanent foothold on the continent, decided, in large part, during the confusion of the first 14 hours, long before the heaviest fighting of the entire campaign had even begun. The wall Rommel spent 2 years reinforcing didn't fail because it lacked concrete, or guns, or trained soldiers to man it. It failed because, for the 14 hours that decided the entire battle, the men behind it could not tell the difference between a doll falling from an airplane and a soldier coming to kill them, and the one man with the authority to unleash Germany's most powerful weapon on that coast was asleep in the mountain, cut off from a command structure engineered months in advance to fail exactly this way, at exactly this moment. Heinz von Luck survived that day and the brutal weeks of fighting through the hedgerows that followed. He would go on to serve on the Eastern Front and later spend years as a prisoner in a Soviet labor camp. He lived until 1997, and in his later years, he spoke and wrote openly about that night. The chaos in the dark fields, the dead phone line, the slow, sickening realization that his own side's rigid command structure had failed the men holding the line, hours before a single real Allied soldier ever crossed his path. Field Marshal Rommel wasn't even in France when the invasion began. Convinced the weather ruled out any landing that, he was still on the road back from Germany while the battle for Normandy was already being lost, hour by hour, to a lie made of burlap and cut telephone wire. He wouldn't reach his headquarters until the evening of June 6th, long after the outcome of the first day had already been decided without him. Major General Wilhelm Falle never got to tell his own story. He was buried where he fell, one of the earliest German casualties of a battle he had feared and correctly predicted only hours before it began. Lieutenant General Speidel, who spent that night trying to build a coherent picture from a flood of contradictions, survived the war. He later became a senior commander in NATO's West German forces during the Cold War. A strange twist for a man whose most defining night in uniform had been spent almost entirely unable to tell fact from fiction. The men and women of the French resistance who cut those telephone lines rarely appear by name in the official histories of D-Day. Many operated under code names their own families never learned. Some were captured and executed in the weeks that followed. Their contribution to the invasion's success was known to only a handful of Allied intelligence officers, until decades later, when declassified records finally let historians piece together just how much of that first day's chaos had been engineered from the ground. Not just the scale of Operation Titanic is still striking to historians today. Records point to several hundred dummy paratroopers dropped across multiple false zones that night, backed by small teams of real Special Air Service soldiers creating just enough gunfire and noise to sell the illusion. Combined with a wave of coordinated resistance sabotage prepared months in advance, it produced a fog of war so dense that some German after-action reports from that night describe landings and firefights that official records now confirm never happened at all. The Atlantic Wall didn't fall to a bigger hammer than the one Germany was already swinging. It fell because, for one critical night, the men who commanded it could not trust their own eyes, their own ears, or their own telephone lines. And by the time they finally could, the war in the West had already tipped permanently away from them. 17 million cubic meters of concrete, defeated in the end by cloth dolls, firecrackers, and a handful of cut telephone wires. Military planners never forgot the lesson. Operation Titanic and the operations built alongside it became foundational case studies in what modern militaries now call information warfare. The idea that an enemy's perception of the battlefield can be a target every bit as decisive as the battlefield itself. Long before satellite, long before cyber attacks, long before anyone had a word for disinformation as a weapon of war, a handful of British and French planners proved something that still holds true today. You don't need to destroy an army's tanks to defeat it. You just need to destroy its certainty. 17 million cubic meters of concrete meant nothing the moment the men behind it no longer knew what was real. 2 in the morning, June 6th, 1944. A major stares at a radio that only hisses static, while shapes he cannot yet explain keep falling from the sky. And somewhere behind him, in the dark, an empire built on 17 million cubic meters of concrete is already starting to come apart. This is one of those stories that sounds almost too strange to be true, and yet every detail of it is on the historical record. If you're watching this, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. It's always something, seeing just how far these stories travel. If you want to see how American abundance shattered the morale of German soldiers inside their own POW camps, the video on your screen right now covers the ice cream shock. And subscribe. If you want more true stories the history books rarely tell quite like this.